The president wants to spy on 200 million Americans without a warrant. Has he read this document, which he was sworn to uphold?
Now, I will not have you libel Abraham Lincoln.
I don't understand the problem with registering guns. We register cars.
Mark Levine brings you the news the government doesn't want you to know.
Today, an explosive story about connections between white supremacists and Islamic terrorists.
When there's a conflict between Scalia's conservative values and the Constitution of the United States, he throws away the Constitution.
We do have secret prisons. That is not what America's all about.
Let's go to Mark in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good evening, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. A new jobs report came out. It was not as favorable as many had hoped, although the unemployment rate has lowered a tick to 8.2%. Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, the Republican chairman, he has his own plan, which the Republican nominee, Mitt Romney, has adopted. I have a feeling this will be the battle that goes into 2012. Also, continued discussion on Trayvon Martin. It came out today that the special prosecutor probably will not appoint a grand jury, which looks like George Zimmerman may get away. I want to talk about that and different perceptions of how race affects this case. Furthermore, the United States Supreme Court, people are still talking about not only the constitutionality of the President's Affordable Health Care Act, but also whether or not President Obama went too far in criticizing the court. And lastly, events in the Middle East, always interesting. In Egypt, the Islamic Brotherhood seems to be moving further and further to take control of Egypt. In Syria, the people are still fighting for freedom. And in Iran, the United States is pushing them hard to enter negotiations to get rid of their nuclear weapons. To discuss all of these issues, I've invited Mark Royce. He's a PhD candidate at George Mason University in political science. He is a self-described conservative. I'm a self-described liberal. We should have plenty of points of disagreement and maybe some agreement as well. Mark,
yes.
Thanks for coming on the Inside Scoop.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start with the jobs report. So it came out, it looks like unemployment is still going down slightly, not as much as we'd hoped, but down to 8.2%. But it was disappointing to many on Wall Street. And I guess my question for you is, the Republicans seem to say that the best way to increase jobs in America is to take money from the middle class and poor people and give it to the super rich. Let me show you. This is an analysis of Paul Ryan's plan. Now, he's the chairman of the House Budget Committee. And this is done by Ezra Klein in the Washington Post. And it shows where the vast majority of the money would go. The vast majority would go to people earning more than $1 million. They get a 12% increase in their taxes, about $265,000 each. Those earning $500,000 would get $47,000 each. Those earning $40,000 to $50,000 would get an increase of about 1.5% or $750. Now, if you look at where the money's coming from, that's the green chart on the right, it shows it's mostly coming from things like Medicaid, Pell Grants, student loans, social services, food stamps, and things like that. It strikes me that this is a budget that takes from the poor, Medicaid, food stamps, and the middle class, things like student loans, and gives it to the super rich. And Republicans seem to believe this is actually going to help increase jobs in America. Do you agree?
Well, no. I don't agree that it just takes from the lower and middle income earners and gives it to the super rich. Do I believe that the Paul Ryan budget would help create jobs in this country? Yes, I do. And I was reviewing the Paul Ryan plan earlier today. And before we address the particular aspect of job creation, I would like to return to the document itself briefly and identify what Paul Ryan identifies as the essential causal argument in the fiscal crisis that he's attempting to address. Paul Ryan, of course, is chairman of the House Budget Committee. The actual name of the document is the Pathway to Prosperity, but it's often colloquially referred to as the Paul Ryan budget. The Paul Ryan plan is primarily about entitlements, and it's primarily about Medicare above all. He perceives the rising cost of medical care as, if you will, the independent variable, and then the corresponding rising costs of Medicare and Medicaid as, if you will, the intervening variable, and then finally the grotesque inflation of our national deficits and spending commitments as the outcome, or if you will, the dependent variable. So for him, and for those who helped him frame that document, that is primarily the issue at hand. So where do we get the new money from? Well, the plan is not primarily about raising taxes. It does include tax reform, which I'll get to later. But to some extent, it is about introducing market-based solutions into Medicare and into Medicaid, but primarily Medicare, which is where the bulk of the costs are. And so if we restructure that system, as well as to liberate costs that are involved in it, then the burden would not so much be shifting it from one program to another, but the ultimate goal would be that individuals would have to pay less for medical care, they would receive a tax subsidy to do so, and would then be empowered to have more of their own individual wealth that they could then save and spend as they wish. Briefly on the taxation issue.
Yes.
Paul Ryan, the Paul Ryan budget does include proposals toward tax reform, the closing of loopholes, the making the system less Byzantine, less complicated, along the lines of something that was done between Reagan and Tip O'Neill back in the 80s. Now, I'm not a Republican Party spokesman. I'm an independent-minded conservative.
I'm not asking you to be.
So I will freely acknowledge that the Ryan budget, in my view, is vague on those parts in terms of which loopholes would be closed, in terms of how the money would be saved. But I think it's a step in the right direction.
Now, Mark, as you know, this is not primarily about, this is not a health care proposal. I mean, the Republicans have not put forward a health care proposal. They want to repeal Obamacare. They say they want to repeal and replace, but as far as I know, there's not a single Republican proposal to do much of anything with health care except for some tinkering around the edges like
it's within the Paul Ryan
malpractice case. But it seems to me that you say it's a deficit reduction plan. Paul Ryan sells it as a deficit reduction plan.
I would say primarily, yes,
and
focusing on Medicare entitlements.
It has $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, primarily to the super rich. It actually gives it's more trillion, 3 times almost trillion in tax cuts as the Bush tax cuts that got us in this massive deficit mess. And where is the money coming from? It's coming from student loans, it's coming from Medicaid, it's coming from food stamps. Some of it comes from Medicare, you're absolutely right. If this were about deficit reduction, why not take the $4.5 trillion and use it to pare down the budget? Why do we have to give that to millionaires and billionaires?
Well, to some extent, I think the analysis that you just delivered is to some extent a caricature of the Ryan plan. You have that $4.5 billion number. Trillion number.
Okay.
Yes, I'm sure you've extrapolated that from the text. What the Ryan budget does do, though, is provide various time horizons as to when various reductions would be made. So I believe, I need to consult the document, but I believe the most taxation would kick in around the year 2030, after which it would begin to decline. So you have it. We have to be concerned with the interval over which that occurs, that 4.5 trillion. Now, why take it from particular social programs?
Why have it at all? Why not? If the idea is you're going to cut the deficit, if that is what Paul Ryan's trying to do, then why not use it to cut the deficit? The Republicans got very upset when President Obama said, I'm going to do temporary stimulus now to help get us out of the recession, and then I'm going to pay it back later. And if you look at...
some of them did vote for it.
Yeah, a few of them, not many. Actually, the stimulus package, I think, got one I got 3 Republican votes in the Senate, and I'm not even sure, maybe got 1 in the House, so it wasn't that many. But in any case, the plan, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which also includes the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, actually led us to a higher deficit in the short run, but a much lower deficit in the long run than the current plan. The Congressional Budget Office looked at Ryan's plan, and it actually leads us to a much greater deficit, mostly not because of the savings occurred by cutting student loans and so forth, because they're giving $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, primarily to the super rich. That's in addition to the Bush tax cuts.
Well,
why not, if the goal is to cut the deficit, use the money to pay for the deficit?
If the goal is to cut the deficit, then both parties need to be honest. Honest with the American people about not just catering to their own constituencies. The Republican Party needs to be honest that taxes, that revenues will have to be increased in order to stave off our fiscal crisis. Whereas the Democratic Party needs to be honest and state that entitlements, primarily Medicare, that's where the bulk of the costs are, the system will have to be radically transformed in order for it to stave us off. So the most...
On Medicare, by the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about health care a little bit later on. So I want to take the health care part of that and put it aside. But primarily,
the most intellectually sound of such proposals, such as Simpson-Bowles, to try to deal with the deficit plan, attack it from 2 directions, raising revenue and cutting social programs.
Okay, and I respect that, but Simpson-Bowles, as you know, they just had a vote, and both Democrats and Republicans voted it down. In fact, more Democrats voted for it than Republicans, but the majority of both parties were against it. So it strikes me that Paul Ryan is not a serious plan, and yet Mitt Romney has endorsed it. Do you think it's a mistake for the Republican nominee to endorse this plan? Here's a guy who's seen as rich and out of touch. And yet what's he doing? He's supporting a plan that's cutting student loans and cutting Medicaid and cutting food stamps so that extremely rich people get a tax cut. seems to me politically, it's a bad idea.
Okay, well, on Mitt Romney briefly, yes, I would totally concur that he has an image problem. He seems too Harvard and he seems too wealthy. Perfect hair, right, as if he just came out of the shower. Looks better in jeans than I do in a suit. So he does need to stop looking like $250 million, even though that is what he's worth. As opposed... However,
as he keeps accidentally reminding us day by day.
Yes, but with regard to the Paul Ryan plan specifically, is it a mistake for him to endorse it? No. Paul Ryan is one of the leading lights of the Republican Party, and his budget, his plan, is an intellectually rigorous and theoretically sound attempt to address our current fiscal crisis. And one more point about the Ryan budget is that certainly a liberal or a Democrat, such as yourself, is certainly at liberty to criticize its flaws, that it doesn't deal with the taxation appropriately, or that its perhaps plan to address entitlements is unrealistic. But I don't think that even his staunchest critics are at liberty to say that it is not an intellectually sincere attempt to deal with our deficit problem. And to be perfectly honest, the Democrats have not put forward anything of equal rigor or impressiveness.
I don't doubt that Paul Ryan sincerely believes in his plan. I disagree with you on the rigor. I think there's an incredible amount of vagueness. I think whenever politicians put forward deficit reduction plans of either party...
It is vague in parts. It's a political document.
Vague. But let me ask you this.
But it's a step in the right direction.
I began this segment talking about the jobs report. Mm-hmm. I'd like to understand philosophically, if you say theoretically, philosophically, that this is good for America, this is good for the economy. Do you believe the Paul Ryan plan will help increase jobs or decrease joblessness in America? And if so, how? How will the Paul Ryan plan in any way increase employment?
Well, I think it will help that if we restructure the spiraling costs of medical care and how much particularly lower and middle income individuals have to pay in order to maintain themselves healthy, with people living longer, with more medical treatments available for infirmities for which people 50 or 60 years ago would have just received no treatment, that will put more money in the hands of the taxpayer. And particularly what Paul Ryan wants to do is he wants to have a refund tax credit so that more people can afford that care. I believe it's $3,000 per individual, $5,000 per family, and then more than that also for those on the Medicaid.
What you're describing is the Affordable Health Care Act. What you're describing is Obamacare. When you say...
I'm describing the Paul Ryan plan.
And the Paul Ryan plan actually takes Medicare and turns it into Obamacare. It's actually very similar. What it does, it requires everyone to buy insurance. He does it... we're going to get to that
not
in
the same sense, but...
We're going to get a break, but I actually think it's a nice transition to talking about health care and the Supreme Court oral arguments, because I think you'll find that Paul Ryan pretty much tries to do what Obama tried to do, and in that way, that tiny way, I think that there's a weird amount of support for it. We're going to take a break, folks. If you want to call in, 888-488-MARK, we'd love to hear from you. We'll be right back.
Some dreams are universal. Dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits.
Inside Scoop.
And give our
Here's
kids
Mark
the
Levine.
power of global knowledge. Because kids...
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. My guest is Mark Royce. He's a PhD candidate in political science at George Mason University. Mark, we were talking about the Ryan Plan before the break and jobs, and you pointed out that the real way to increase economic prosperity in America is to lower the cost of health care, which is spiraling. And, I would agree with you. I think that health care costs are spiraling, and it is the best way to decrease costs. But to me, that's exactly what the Affordable Health Care Act tried to do. I mean, what does it do? It lowers costs. It has very clear ways that the government can negotiate to lower prices. It says that if you can't afford health care, it will allow you to buy health care. And if you can't afford health care, you're going to have to buy health care, the individual mandate. A Paul Ryan plan actually is similar in the sense that it takes Medicare, people out of the socialized government health care that, let's face it, most Americans like, and puts them in this middle public-private system, the Obama system. So it seems to me that I'd like to see everybody in Medicare. So I think that Obama is doing a step in the right direction by taking those of us under 65 and putting us in a public-private system. But I think Paul Ryan's going in the wrong direction by taking those Americans over 65 and moving them essentially to the same system. What I find interesting is that the United States Supreme Court spent 6 hours talking about why this is unconstitutional, at least 5 justices did, and the whole right-wing radio sphere was full of people saying, oh, this is clearly unconstitutional. Paul Ryan's plan, strikes me, is exactly the same with one tiny little distinction. What Obama does is he doesn't tax anyone, and if you don't get health care, there's a penalty. What Ryan does is he taxes everyone, and if you do get health care, there's a credit. Financially, it's exactly the same thing. And yet some people are arguing that makes Ryan care constitutional and Obamacare not constitutional. What's your view?
Well, financially is different from legally. And so if you want to talk about the right-wing blogosphere, the source of their agitation, of course, is the individual mandate from the Affordable Care Act. Let's call it by its real name rather than...
I completely agree. That's fine with me.
An implicitly derogatory name, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, which requires everyone to buy health insurance or face a penalty. Now, I'm not sure I concluded our last segment by saying that reforming Medicare is the best way to create jobs in America. I'm not sure that applies. I think tax reform and other measures are also important. But the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, if you will, versus the Paul Ryan plan and the constitutionality thereof. So, why did the Supreme Court spend 6 hours on such and such issue? Well, is that really unjustified that the Supreme Court of the United States should spend 6 hours of debate on an issue that is convulsing the country? It doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
Well, to me, the issue is not whether it's convulsing the country. The issue is not whether something is...
It certainly is the political...
Politically, it absolutely is. But to me, it's all about the Constitution of the United States.
Me too.
And that's what the U.S. Supreme Court should be looking at, not whether something is wise or unwise, not whether they would have voted for it or voted against it. There's plenty of things America does that are incredibly controversial.
You sound almost like a strict constructionist. Just like
I am a strict constructionist. I'm a firm strict constructionist, and I say that Article 1, Section 8...
we agree on that.
Well, that's good. Well, let's construe.
Strict construction and literalism.
Then let's construe.
If you will.
Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and general welfare of the United States. So they can tax to provide for the general welfare of the United States.
Yes, they can.
It seems to me that that's exactly what health care is. It's a tax to provide for the general welfare of the United States. They can also regulate commerce among the several states. Clearly, health care...
Among the several states.
That's right.
Not between the federal government and the individual. That's a different matter.
Right. In other words, when people are participating in commerce in the states, they can regulate commerce. They can even, by the way, require commerce. There's the famous case of Ollie's Barbecue. That's the 1960s era case construed in the Civil Rights Act, where Ollie's Barbecue in Alabama didn't want to serve black people. And he said, you must sell the black people. The government actually required him to create commerce that Ollie didn't want to do.
Well, the federal government had a pivotal role in the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
My point,
though, is I'm glad you agree that was the right decision. I think you would. My point is, if they can regulate commerce with Ollie's Barbecue, they can regulate commerce with something that's 1/6 of the nation's economy. So whether it's the general welfare,
regulating
the tax
commerce
laws,
is a different matter from creating commerce.
But that's what they do with Ollie's Barbecue. They force him to sell to people he doesn't want to sell to. That's creating commerce.
It's with a non-discrimination issue at the heart of it. So I suppose in that case, yes, perhaps
I would
it is,
argue it's the same thing with health care. I think actually...
But more importantly, what the justices argued is that if the federal government can force you to buy health insurance, they could also force you to buy a cell phone, for instance, or tennis shoes, or any other commodity or item that a particular administration deems as important.
And that's a silly argument. When people
but that frightens me.
challenge the constitutionality of Social Security, they said if they can give you a pension at 65, they can give you a pension at 55, or 45, or 25, or 12. They can pay for you all your life. And they said, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
But to me, it's hard to say that would be a silly argument, as you put it, if it's being entertained by the 9 justices at the pinnacle of their profession.
I still think it's silly. I think when Scalia gets up there and says, if they can make you buy health care, they can make you buy broccoli, I think he's being silly. And the reason I think it's silly is that there's all these slippery slope arguments. Frankly, you need to address the case at hand. And in the case of health care, you have people who do not have health insurance, who can afford health insurance, and don't buy it until the moment they go to the emergency room. And then they say, yes, now I want health insurance, which with respect is kind of like me saying, I don't want fire insurance until my house is on fire, and then I want to purchase fire insurance then and there. It allows people to misuse the system.
And it's ethically irresponsible. One thing Paul Ryan wants to do is make these things available at emergency rooms at DMVs. But if we are to criticize those who are way above us politically, I think it was also irresponsible, or certainly unsound, for the president to lecture the Supreme Court like he did last week.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Because all the president said was that if the United States Supreme Court were to strike this down, it would be unprecedented. Much as Citizens United was unprecedented, Bush v. Gore was unprecedented. There's a whole series of cases, all the way up to Justice Scalia actually saying that a woman growing marijuana for her own use in California, not selling it to anyone because she's in dire pain, inconsistent with California's medical marijuana law, that the federal government could prohibit it because it could regulate interstate commerce because she might just sell it someday.
Well, I have no practical knowledge of marijuana. You'll be happy to.
My point is that if he's willing to take federal control over interstate commerce that far, over one woman smoking, growing marijuana in her own yard, clearly health care, which is 1/6 of the nation's economy, is far more interstate commerce than one woman growing a marijuana plant.
Well, I'll certainly acknowledge, being non-aligned that I am, I'm not the spokesman for anyone, that there is a tension between the individualist conservatism that you find in the Tea Party and other libertarians and the nationalist conservatism of the mainstream Republican Party, strong on national defense, much less the Bush doctrine and invasive national security procedures. So there's a tension there and maybe even an inconsistency. But you were citing the legal precedents of the activist court. I would return to Marbury versus Madison, in which there certainly is a precedent for the Supreme Court declaring acts of Congress unconstitutional.
Absolutely.
And the president, a constitutional law scholar, seemed unaware of that pivotal.
President Obama
his
is certainly aware of Marbury versus Madison. No one disputes that the United States Supreme Court has the right to declare a law unconstitutional. The dispute, however, is what is constitutional. They can't just say, we don't like this law, therefore it's unconstitutional. They have to base it in this document. And what Obama was saying was not they don't have the power to do it, but that it would be unprecedented, unwise, and activist for them to base their
our head
their
of state is entitled to his opinion, obviously.
It's a decision in politics rather than in the Constitution. Let me tell you, we have someone on the phone, and I like to invite listeners who are listening in to ask their questions, make their comments. Dan from Chantilly, welcome to the Inside Scoop. Are you there on the line, Dan? We're having trouble hearing you. Can we turn up Dan's volume, please? I'm afraid we've lost Dan from Chantilly. All right. Well, if Dan gets back on the line, please put him through. I do like to hear from callers. If you want to call in, it's 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. I do want to move on. If we get Dan, I'm sure it's probably on health care. We'll bring back. But I want to talk a little bit about the Trayvon Martin case.
All right.
This has been a case that has really tore Americans apart. Some argue there's a white perspective and a black perspective. I don't know whether that's the case or maybe it's a liberal perspective, a conservative perspective. My perspective, frankly, is just someone who's seeking the facts. And I listened to all the 911 tapes. I listened to George Zimmerman say that someone looks suspicious because he's walking around, looking around as if you're not free in America to do that, because he was holding something in his hand or had his hand in his waistband. We know George Zimmerman had a gun in his waistband. Maybe that's why he felt that a 17-year-old, putting Skittles there is treacherous. He said things like these a-holes always get away, and they asked him not to pursue him, and he did indeed. It strikes me there's a pretty strong case. I mean, I'm not convicting the man. I'm not on the jury. That's the role of the jury. But there seems to be at least a strong case for probable cause and indictment. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So we agree on this.
Yes,
and it shouldn't be a racial issue. If the facts are there, we have the 911 tapes, George Zimmerman should be indicted.
Yes, I agree. In fact, I signed the petition, which has attracted more than 2 million Americans to that effect.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that across liberals and conservatives. I tell you, we have Dan from Chantilly back. Dan, I think we can hear you now. At least I hope so.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Hey, incredible
you turned your volume up. Go ahead.
Balanced debate. I have to give you both a lot of kudos for. I mean, as far as from the left and right perspective, I've never heard a better balance.
Appreciate that.
I wanted to bring up the idea that I think the left is missing something in this debate over the Supreme Court. I think there's a larger issue being fought. You brought up the civil rights movement. I think this whole, just like with the Blunt Amendment, is a Trojan horse. It's not about Obamacare per se. It's about federalism, and you have the federal government having to come in and impose something. Of course, you got interstate commerce. If I have health care in one state and I go to health care in another state, does that state have to honor it? Interstate commerce. Of course, we have to have regulation between that, because if I'm in one company, if I'm in Boeing in Washington, D.C., and I move to Boeing in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, then does the regulation still apply? If I have health care with that company, you have to have a federal government somehow regulate that.
So are you saying that it is constitutional or it isn't constitutional?
Yes, it is constitutional.
Okay.
And the larger point is to get to the whole thing what you said about the civil rights. They're still fighting the civil rights movement, because the last time they tried to overturn a law was when we passed the civil rights law of 1964. They were challenging a duly passed law.
And we may have to take a break, and we'll get a response I'll give you a response to Dan after the break. But I just want to get your point, Dan. Are you saying that if the United States Supreme Court overturns the Affordable Health Care Act, that they would be acting in a political or activist fashion rather than in a constitutional fashion?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So you agree with the president?
You know what would happen? Let's say if this thing in Sanford, Florida goes down, right? The federal government right now could go in and charge someone with the civil rights law, right? Well, if the Supreme Court can say, okay, the states have more, Romney care can stand, but Obamacare can't.
Why not try the civil
when
rights
Obama
act?
goes in to try to prosecute someone, then maybe Boehner can go to the Congress and nullify what he tries to do.
Thank you for your call, Dan. I really appreciate it. When we come back, I'm going to ask Mark Royce that question. If they can overturn the Affordable Health Care Act, why can't they overturn the Civil Rights Act? For that matter, why not overturn Medicare and Social Security? It seems to me this is all government control. The question is not whether these programs are wise, but whether they're constitutional, and the slippery slope may just go in the other direction. 888-488-MARK. We'll be right back after this.
I need a job.
Necesito trabajo.
I would like to speak English better.
Me gustaría hablar inglés mejor.
I want to be a U.S. citizen.
Quisiera ser ciudadano de los Estados Unidos.
For over 35 years,
Por más de 35 años,
the Hispanic Committee of Virginia has been serving our community.
el Comité Hispano de Virginia ha estado sirviendo a nuestra comunidad.
Job training and placement,
Capacitación, ayuda para conseguir trabajo,
education for children and adults,
educación para niños y adultos,
immigration, naturalization, and medical referrals.
ayuda para los procesos de inmigración y naturalización y orientación sobre médicos
Are a small part of what we do.
son solo una pequeña parte de lo que hacemos.
For help, information, or to volunteer,
Para ayuda, información o para ofrecerse como voluntario,
contact the Hispanic Committee of Virginia,
comuníquese con el Comité Hispano de Virginia,
helping everyone participate more fully in American society.
ayudando a todos a participar plenamente en la sociedad norteamericana.
Hey, Lena, where's yours? Would you notice if you were missing half your kidney function? According to the National Kidney Foundation, 20 million people have chronic kidney disease, and 20 million more may be at risk and not even know it. Anyone with high blood pressure, diabetes, or family history of chronic kidney disease is at risk. Early diagnosis is vitally important. To get the whole story, talk to your doctor and visit the National Kidney Foundation at kidney.org or call for a free brochure. Because when it comes to chronic kidney disease, you might not know.
Here again, the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine, discussing the issues of the day with Mark Royce. He is a PhD candidate at George Mason University in political science. I am a self-proclaimed liberal. He's a self-proclaimed conservative. We sometimes disagree with our parties, Democrats and Republicans, but that's because we're independent thinkers, and we do that, and you should do that too. If you want to call in and express your view, please do so. 888-488-MARK. 888-488-6275. We'd like to hear from you. And, of course, prior to the break, we heard from a caller, from Dan from Chantilly. And I think Dan raises a good point. He says, if the Supreme Court can strike down the Affordable Health Care Act, as it looks like 5 justices may well want to do, why can't they strike down the Civil Rights Act and Social Security and Medicare? Because if it's not regulation of interstate commerce to deal with health care, I mean, the clearest example is Medicare. That is a government-run healthcare system. And yet no one seems to have challenged its constitutionality. Isn't there possibly a slippery slope in the other direction?
Sure, there's a slippery slope. On the issue of civil rights, first of all, to begin with that, why the Supreme Court could, in theory, potentially overturn the Civil Rights Act? Well, it couldn't, because civil rights are enshrined in our Constitution, which, just to return to the basics of American government, the Constitution stands above the Supreme Court.
But you say enshrined. There's two ways it's enshrined in our Constitution. One is the 14th Amendment, equality under the law, which I think...
Those amendments passed after the Civil War.
Which would be the perfect ones to deal with civil rights. But as you recall, the Ollie's Barbecue case actually didn't dwell on the 14th Amendment. It actually dealt with interstate commerce. Because basically the point was that states could discriminate, could allow discrimination, and this guy, Ollie, wanted to discriminate, and he said, I'm in Alabama, I'm serving people in Alabama, and they said, aha, well, the Interstate Commerce Clause says we have power to regulate you. If they hurt the Interstate Commerce Clause, isn't there a slippery slope?
Well, that's why we have a balance of power, and that was the genius of our framers, of our founding fathers, to have 3 branches of government, which was based on Montesquieu's formulation. So, what could the court potentially do? Well, the Supreme Court could never strike down civil rights. That would be fundamentally against our political values, our political culture, as we've emerged.
I would argue
they
couldn't choose the President of the United States, because that would be fundamentally against American culture and American values. And then came 2000. In 2000, they chose the president. They chose Bush to be president, even though Gore won the election. So, to an extent,
they did. But it's kind of like scoring on the penalty kick at the end of the soccer game. In 2000, Gore had all those opportunities to win votes, to win his home state of Tennessee, to win other opportunities. So I think it would be a little bit of a caricature of history to say that the Supreme Court elected George Bush. Gore had all those opportunities.
I don't think it's a caricature at all when Gore won the most votes, not only in the nation, but in Florida. But instead of arguing Bush v. Gore, the larger point is that we're concerned. I'm concerned. Dan's concerned. A lot of Americans are concerned. We look at Bush v. Gore. We look at Citizens United. Two, I think, of the most extreme cases in the last 10 years.
And Citizens United concerns me the most.
Well, I'm glad it does, because it overturned more than 100 years of law. Civil rights laws are only 50 years old. The laws that the Supreme Court overturned in Citizens United were more than 100 years old. They ended corruption by preventing corporate donations.
I don't know. They ended corruption.
Well, excuse me.
They did.
They attempted.
Okay.
Their goal was to decrease corruption.
I would give too much credit to that.
They didn't end it, of course, but it existed for 100 years, and no one disturbed them. No one even challenged them. In fact, the litigants, the Citizens United, didn't even raise the question of these 100-year-old laws. The Supreme Court said, we want you to write a brief on this, and then they overturned them.
That's true. The Citizens United case does concern me. We'll be happy to talk about that. It's not true, though, that it's been a linear progression from getting money out of campaigns. So you had rulings such as Buckley versus Vallejo, in which
it was decided
that an individual could spend as much money as he wanted to. So it's not like we've just moved one direction for the last 100 years. There has been back and forth. But yes, Citizens United does concern me. It concerns me primarily because, especially within the Republican Party, you've seen the fear of moderate incumbents that they're going to get primaried by super PACs who can then descend upon the race pump money into an incumbent, and then defeat that person. And so that bothers me.
I mean, I'm glad we agree on that, but my overall point, and I think it was Dan's point, is that whether you look at Bush v. Gore or Citizens United or perhaps the overturning of the Affordable Health Care Act, there seems to be a pattern. And it's the same pattern that President Obama was criticizing. It's a pattern of judges putting their political views ahead of the Constitution of the United States and saying, we don't like Gore, so Bush wins. We want more money in elections, so we're going to throw out 100-year-old laws. And we don't like President Obama's health care bill. We're going to throw it out. There's a concern of judicial activism. And conservatives used to complain all the time about judicial activism. Today, you hear them largely defending the court, saying the court can do whatever they want to do. I would hope you agree with me that the court should put politics completely aside and rule according to the Constitution of the United States.
Yes, they should. It's difficult. Obviously, our Supreme Court justices, though they should think primarily in legal terms, they are influenced by politics. They are influenced by the prevailing values. But as much, perhaps, conservative activism, if you will, as there may have been in various cases, we've also seen liberal activism. The ultimate example, of course, is Roe v. Wade, which to some extent created the conservative movement, as well as the Miranda ruling, which greatly extended the scope beyond of what people captured by the police were entitled to. So I think both liberals and conservatives are guilty of judicial activism.
Here's the thing. The Miranda ruling is based in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which, as you know...
Well, all rulings are based on some...
Well, but the Fifth Amendment says very clearly you can't be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against yourself, so that's the right to remain silent. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to have the assistance of counsel in your defense. So you may disagree with where the court came down in the Miranda ruling, but clearly they were taking rights that are in the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and they were putting them in their own way, but they weren't making stuff up out of whole cloth. The concern, I think, that and Roe v. Wade, I agree with you, it's a much tougher decision. I don't think they ruled the right way. I would have grounded Roe v. Wade in the Fourth Amendment, the protection of your persons, so the government cannot seize you have the right to be secure in your persons. To me, a woman has a right to be secure in her person. I actually think a much stronger argument can be made for Roe v. Wade.
Well, of course, conservatives argue that the baby has the right to be protected by its own person.
But my point is not that one is rightly decided. Obviously, I think it is. But my point is that these are things that can be grounded in the text of the Constitution. The fear is that in Bush v. Gore and Citizens United, and I would argue with the Affordable Health Care Act, there's no grounding in the text of the Constitution. Bush v. Gore, you had a state government deciding under state law that Florida should count its votes, and the United States Supreme Court said, Florida, we don't want you to count your votes, Bush wins. In Citizens United, you have 50 states saying corporations give money leads to corruption, and the United States Supreme Court says, we don't think it'll lead to corruption. We're throwing that out.
And again, you have a 5-4 division between, if you will, conservatives and liberals on the court. On the Bush v. Gore, though, since you raised both of these cases, I think it's important to not just cast blame upon the Supreme Court, because you had all of these different levels before you get to the Supreme Court. You had the Electoral College, you had the House of Representatives, you have an entire presidential election, and they receiving the case was only the final step. You had heroism on the part of conservatives. So in that particular instance, you had the Florida Senate, who refused to ratify the electors because they felt it would disrupt the continuity of democracy. And so ultimately it led to the Supreme Court.
You had the Florida Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the state of Florida, say that the votes needed to be counted. And under Florida law, the Florida Supreme Court has to be respected. And the Florida legislature actually has no power to overturn the Florida Supreme Court's opinions based on the Florida Constitution. Well, people have the power to do that. Would be the Florida. So you have the highest court in the state of Florida, and the Supreme Court, which is supposed to respect states' rights. Conservatives used to love states' rights. They don't like states' rights when it can lead to Gore being president. To me, this is flip-flopping, and I would like to hear a principled conservative say, yes, we should have respected states' rights. We should have let Florida count their own votes as their highest court needed to do. But my real concern is that we have judicial activism, and that's President Obama's concern. We have judges who are not grounded.
Well, they're human beings. Yes. And they have their own political values, and I think that's the world that we live in. And so that is why, ultimately, let's recall how these people get there. They are appointed through the legislative process, they're confirmed, they're made there, and then they're immune to criticism. Once they don that robe, and
I don't think they're immune to criticism, and that's why I'm glad President Obama...
They can't be fired.
Well, but they can't be fired absent, real...
But the point is, if you don't like the opinions or the record of a particular judge, then it needs to be stopped in the legislative process through which those people go. And that's the appropriate mechanism.
Well, I certainly agree the only way to stop this is for President Obama to be re-elected and for us to have another justice on the court who respects the Constitution.
Well, you're entitled to your opinion, certainly.
But my point is, so is the president entitled to his opinion. And I think that it is rare for the president to call out the United States Supreme Court. It's not unprecedented. Richard Nixon famously complained about the Warren Court. And in a case where the justices are going so far
but when he
off
did
the
so
rails,
in his State of the Union, he went even further, which
I agree with
which I felt was inappropriate. They can't talk back.
Why not? Why not? Richard Nixon famously complained about the Warren Court. Again, I don't think...
A whole generation of Republicans ran against the Warren Court.
That's right. Exactly. Look, I have no problem with the president saying that this is too far. There's a difference between a court deciding a close case, an ambiguous case, and the court going way off outside the text of the Constitution and doing it for political reasons.
I agree.
I think in this case that's what they're doing, and so I support Obama's criticism.
Okay.
Let me move on, though. I want to talk about what's going on in the Middle East.
Yes.
Because there's a lot going on. Of course, the Arab Spring began last spring, and it's all over the map. It's Egypt and Libya and Tunisia. It's Bahrain and Yemen and Syria and Iran and even to some extent in Jordan, Algeria, and Morocco. And I've probably forgotten a couple. It's all over the map, and people are uprising and trying to take control of the governments. And in Syria, they're being massacred. It strikes me, and I'd be curious to see...
9,000 dead since the uprising last year. So
it's horrible, and it's disgusting. And it strikes me that this question of what the United States should do when for example, a pro-American dictator makes it harder with Mubarak, is killing his own people. And then people who are opposing him, the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, are just as extreme in a different direction. We had this problem in the 1970s. We had right-wing dictators in Latin America who were murderously doing horrible, killing their own people.
Argentina and so forth.
And the people who were opposing them tended to be communists in support of the Soviet Union, and they were not Democrats themselves. I think we have a battle in the Arab Spring between bad people and bad people. And it strikes me that we need to support people and prevent them from being killed, but have no illusions of the fact that neither side is likely to end this without blood on their hands.
I think that is a sobering conclusion with which I largely agree. The changes that we are seeing right now in the Middle East, in the Islamic countries, are so epic, so comprehensive, and so sweeping that I don't think anyone... I know no one has all the answers, no one can say which way it is going to go, and we're ultimately along for the ride, and we're all watching and waiting to see what happens. I think that American policy and the administration has been criticized for not being internally consistent, for supporting some despots, particularly the Gulf monarchies, but not others, so Libya, Tunisia, and then letting Mubarak also go. I do not fault him for that. I think that internal consistency of strategy is almost impossible in such a situation.
Here's what I want to do.
So many different actors, so many different countries.
When we come back from break, I want to go country by country with as much time as we have in the last segment. Let's talk about Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and definitely Syria and certainly Iran. And let's try, you and me, to find some consistency, some principle which we can advise the president or Congress. Because it strikes to me that liberals and conservatives are all over the map on these. And let's try to find a solution ourselves if we can. 888-488-MARK if you want to give your answers. We'll be right back after this.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. One of some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try.
Only you.
Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rigged out money. Nothing very nice. A holy smile. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water.
At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site.
That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff.
You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay.
that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent! Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
The Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
I'm your host, Mark Levine. We have one segment to go, and this is your last chance to call in if you want to comment on anything to do with American foreign policy in the Middle East, specifically on countries related to the Arab Spring, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia. If you want to call in, we want to hear from you. 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. My guest is Mark Royce. He is a PhD candidate at George Mason University in political science, and I'm glad I've got a student of history and political science here because this is enormously complex. In Egypt, we had a dictator who, of course, we can go back to Anwar Sadat. They famously, Egypt tilted toward the Russians through the 70s. Then they moved and they were our dictator, if you will, pro-American dictator in the 80s, 90s, and 00s under Mubarak. I think it was Franklin Roosevelt who famously said of, and I think this was Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard.
He's our bastard.
I
believe it was SOB rather than bastard.
Oh, excuse me. All right, fine.
Okay, no.
There you go. He may be an SOB, but he's our SOB.
Yeah.
The point is, there is a school in American political thought, some call it realpolitik. Henry Kissinger is sort of famous for the school that says, you know what? He's a dictator. He's a horrible person. He tortures his own people. He gives no freedoms at home, but he supports American interests. We need to be behind that person. And then there are people who say, no, we should never support dictators. We should support people overthrowing them. And my heart goes with those people, but I recognize that all too often when people overthrow dictators, you can go back to the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, you find that people overthrow the dictators. Many of them are very good people. I think in Egypt, for example, many of the people in Tahrir Square were good, liberal, and I use that not in a classical liberal sense, people who support democracy, wanted to overthrow because Mubarak was a terrible, oppressive dictator. But now, because the majority of Egypt is poor and uneducated, the majority are voting for the Muslim Brotherhood, which I fear could become a theocracy like Iran. So we were in a complete devil's bind. You had Mubarak and you had the Islamic Brotherhood. I don't support either of them. I support those little Democrats in Tahrir Square who are the minority.
And where are they? Yeah.
Well, they exist and they're complaining. But now you have a military that's following Mubarak and sort of following his footsteps. And they're still sort of kind of pro-American a little bit. And the Muslim Brotherhood
heavily trained by America.
Sure.
Deep institutional ties between the American and Egyptian military.
Yes, but they are corrupt and they don't believe in democracy and they are beating up people in the squares. And then you have the Muslim Brotherhood who claims to have reformed itself, but behind our back they're trying to take away women's rights and religious freedoms. We're between a rock and a hard place, aren't we here?
We are. We are. We always have been in the Middle East, and I'm afraid that we always will be. With regard to the realpolitik, realism, if you will, is probably the dominant theory of international relations in terms of the practice of it. I myself would subscribe to a moderate or modified realism. I'm not as cynical as to say that the human rights record of a particular dictator or regime does not matter. But then on the other hand, I think the sobering reality of international politics is that anarchy is often demonstrably worse than despotism.
So in this case...
And we certainly see that in the Middle East.
Well, but in this case, let's talk about Egypt. In Egypt, I don't think we're leading to anarchy. I think we're actually moving from one despotism to another despotism. I think we're moving from a Shah of Iran-style despotism, perhaps to a theocratic despotism. Right now, the Muslim Brotherhood is not as bad as the government of Iran. I hope and pray they never will be. But that is my concern. And yet, I fully support withdrawing aid from Mubarak. I think when people are marching in the streets and being mowed down, we've got to be on the side of the people. The United States, for historic
they weren't
reasons,
being mowed down, actually. That's why one reason why they were victorious is because the army refused to fire back, which is
there was some,
essentially,
but not as much as
nothing like Syria.
Nothing like Syria.
But when the army refuses to fire back, that is essentially the point of no return. But on the issue of Egypt, we have a presidential election coming up there at the end of May, and so obviously who wins and whether or not that whoever wins will be seen as legitimate is of tremendous importance. And the latest candidate to enter as of Friday was Omar Suleiman, who is the former...
The military candidate.
The
Mubarak candidate.
We're afraid that he's preferred by the military. He certainly was the right-hand man in terms of the intelligence of the old regime. So could the old regime be striking back to some extent?
But see, here we have
That's the concern, but he's experienced and so forth.
But the Islamic Brotherhood promised they weren't going to field a candidate, and then they say the military didn't keep their word, and
there was considerable debate within the Muslim Brotherhood as to whether or not they would field a candidate and whether or not be democratic.
So now they're fielding a candidate, and that scares me. The military is fielding a candidate, and that scares me. The liberals are fielding a candidate too. That's the ones I want to win, but they'll probably get the third most amount of votes in a society like that. In such a case, do you think that President Obama should do more? Should we candidly go out and say we think that the liberal way, the third way, is the best way? Not theocracy, not military dictatorship, but a true liberal democracy.
Essentially endorse one of the, if candidates or particular movements.
Essentially.
I think he should do so, but implicitly and carefully. If the people as a whole perceive...
Because he's probably going to lose, to be fair.
Well, if the people as a whole perceive that such and such faction is backed by America, well, that compromises their chances there.
True.
So any endorsement needs to be careful, needs to be sort of inside the system, as it were, and only sent to the right people rather than publicly as a whole.
I would like to see American aid conditioned on improvements in civil rights and freedom of speech and things like that. And I think we could give a carefully worded message equally both to the military dictatorship and to the possible Islamic Brotherhood dictatorship that we're going to be looking. We're going to see how you treat women. We're going to see how you treat Christians, Coptic Christians. We're going to be seeing whether you allow a free press. We're going to be seeing whether you round up people and aid, no matter who does it. And we can actually set a single standard. So it doesn't matter whether it's the Mubarak people or the Islamic Brotherhood people, and set a single standard, a standard that actually the liberal Democrats would endorse. So they would actually endorse such a standard. That would be a way to help them, at least we can. It probably won't help enough, but at least to set a consistent view that I actually think should be applied to all countries. We should, we're not going to invade China, and we're not going to stop them from torturing.
And we're not. Let's be fair.
People.
We're not going to be able to hold them accountable.
Of course not.
Rights.
But that doesn't mean we can't set the standard and say that we think the Chinese government should treat the Tibetans with freedom. They won't, but we can still set the standard.
And we do try to do that. We try to poke them in the eye about Tibet to the extent that we can.
And that we actually can be somewhat consistent. I actually supported what we did in Libya. I thought it was the right way to go. The people were uprising, but we helped them uprise.
That would have put you at variance with many liberals.
And some conservatives as well. I also strongly support us helping the Syrian rebels. Now, again, I don't think we should do it via invasion. I think that's the wrong way to go. But arming them, air support,
there's a continuum between essentially symbolic and ultimately meaningless punitive sanctions on Syria, an economy the size of Pittsburgh, and full-scale military invasion. You can use the CIA, you can use Black Ops, you can arm the Syrian uprising, and I think such implicit intervention is long overdue, so we agree on that.
We do agree on that, and I think, let me say why it's important, because I've had people on the left and right criticize me for this view. On the right, I'm criticized for being naive, as if I think that the people that are going to take over are going to be, Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. I don't. When I was...
or at least Daniel Webster and Henry Clay.
I recognize when I supported us backing away from Mubarak that the Islamic Brotherhood was likely to take over. But it seems to me that when people are in the streets arguing for freedoms, we've got to be on the people's side.
We do.
And that would include even allies such as Bahrain. Now, I understand the Sixth Fleet is headquartered there. I understand all the Realpolitik people don't like me for saying that. But even if we don't change the government, like we're not going to change China, we need to consistently say the same kind of rhetoric. Otherwise, we are being hypocritical, aren't we?
Yes, I mean, there's variation across the different countries. There's also longitudinal variation from supporting Hosni Mubarak in the 1980s and 1990s to trying to support him in 2011, at the start of the revolution. So these things change, and as they change, the moral obligation changes. So I think that supporting Mubarak 10 years ago would be a very different sort of decision from supporting him at the start of the revolution. So to some extent, our ethical obligations are socially constructed by what the media is reporting on, constructed by our knowledge of the situation, and by how the people, and to what extent they're expressing themselves.
What do you advocate in Syria specifically? If you were President of the United States, what would be the extent of your... We both agree invasion is too much. We both agree that talking a lot and that some sanctions is too little. Where would you draw the line?
I would draw the line with buffer zone between Syria and Turkey, partially overseen by us. We saw today...
Safe haven.
Safe haven. We saw the Syrian army today fire into a refugee camp across the border into Turkey, which was the first time that had happened. Right. So buffer zone, as well as arming the insurgents, or the uprising in Syria, through the CIA and through other covert activities. That would essentially be my solution.
Turkey is a NATO ally. If Syria fires a shot across the border into Turkey, that may just give us the international standing
of Article 5.
After all, a NATO country has been attacked. Sounds to me like that actually might be our excuse to get in and actually help the Syrian people.
Well, it might be an excuse and it might be a pretext. If I were president, I wouldn't be searching for excuses or pretexts.
You don't need it.
No, well, maybe if you don't need it, I think that you should never go to war, undertake military action under essentially a false pretext. I mean, if Syria fires a bullet or a round, as they did today, into Turkey, I don't perceive of that as an attack on NATO.
Okay, let me go to the last question, which is Iran. I don't
hardest
think
of all.
I don't think either one of us trusts the motives of the Iranian government. I think that this latest round of negotiations is a pretext by the Iranian government to try to keep their nuclear program going and to try to string the West along. The sanctions appear to actually start to be hurting, and I'm glad to see that. I think that as the Europeans join in, the Iranian government will get strangled economically. The question comes, of course, if they're 3 months away, if they're 6 months away,
or if the point of no return has already been passed. Perhaps the sanctions appear to be working. I think maybe what's working even more than the sanctions is the imminent threat of force.
I think so too.
Of an Israeli strike on Iran, preemptive military strike, within the next few months.
But here's the thing. Everyone talks about the fact that the Israeli zone is smaller than the American zone. In other words, Israel has enough power, probably, to take out Iran's nuclear device today and over the next few months. But starting July, August, September, as it gets deeper in the mountains, Israel loses its power to stop it, and then only the United States has power to stop it.
Some experts believe it's already lost it.
It may have. It may have. And my question is, should the United States use military force to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
We ourselves?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I think that would involve us and precipitate a conflagration in the Middle East that would be immense. If Israel does so,
we should support Israel doing it, but not do it ourselves. When I say support, I don't mean
be involved.
Quietly say we know what's going on and not.
That would be my essential answer. Yes, the United States cannot be perceived as militarily attacking another country. If Israel were to, if you will, take the lead to some extent, then yes, we would be involved. We would have to be, but we should not bomb Iran. No, I think that would be a strategic blunder.
Well, I'll tell you, we have to make a decision very soon. It may
yes,
be, like I say, it may happen in a matter of months. Mark Royce, I want to thank you very much for the Inside Scoop. An hour goes extremely fast.
It does.
Folks, if you want to see this show, you can go to marklevinetalk.com. You can comment on it and let me know what you think about it. You can also come to my Facebook fan page, the Mark Levine fan page. Let me know what you think of the Inside Scoop or any of the shows. And I hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back next week, another edition.